Hello, welcome to the fifth and final session in Othona's series, Climate Crisis, What Can We Do in 22? And if you've been with us for earlier sessions, welcome back. Today, our main topic is going to be rewilding and the reintroduction of species that perhaps were here in the past and have disappeared from the UK in recent time. After we see a film, there will be a chance for us to have general discussion, any comments, and happy to take any comments or questions arising from any of the 5 sessions we've held, but particularly from this morning's, before we bring the whole thing to a bit of a close. What are we hearing about this morning? Well, we're going to be watching together a filmed presentation. This film is one of a series called the Help Our Planet, the Dorset Talks. The Help Our Planet series is a brainchild of our friend Philip Howes, Professor Philip Howes from Burton Bradstock. And I've got his permission to use just one of those talks for this series today. But there are other talks, and we'll have a link that you can follow if you want to learn more about the Help Our Planet talks. This one was given live in the Marine Theatre in Lyme Regis by Derek Gow. And Derek is an acknowledged expert on rewilding and reintroductions. He knows so much about it and is so enthusiastic and committed about it that it's hard to keep up at first, I found, because he has just so much he wants to communicate and it comes thick and fast. But I trust that you, like me, will find this a fascinating watch. Afterwards, as I say, we will open up for the rest of this time on Zoom. Unfortunately, Derek isn't here, so he can't answer questions. But let's have a conversation among ourselves, and if there is anything that I can give you even half an answer to, I'll try to do that. The filmed presentation by Derek, which is illustrated, he brings a lot of his own pictures to illustrate what he's saying, lasts the best part of an hour. So if you're sitting comfortably, I turn towards V Churchill, who's doing all the technical driving this morning. Let's begin with the Help Our Planet talk from Derek Gow.
Okay, we all live lives that are distracted. We surround ourselves by all sorts of things that are not real. We find them comfortable, and in the end they become normal. So if it's a football club, if it's it's so many of the myriad things that absorb us, that in the end, really the vast majority of us living on this planet today have completely lost track of all that's real. I'm going to start a story, and as I start a story, because I've been used to dealing with relatively small children who are slowly becoming teenagers and much more obstreperous by the second, I've spent a lot of time in the last few years watching lots of kids' films, and there are some really clear analogies in those for where we are and where we're going, but also for where we in the end might be. We live on an island that's entirely dominated by us. The idea, when you read an article on Twitter or Facebook or see somebody commenting on the news, that anything that resembles an ecosystem still survives here is complete and utter nonsense. Everything is down to us. 23 million acres of Britain, roughly about 70% of the land that can be farmed, is down to agriculture. And where there's no agriculture, you have commercial forests and plantations, serried ranks, quite commonly still, of conifers under which there is very little life. When you come to rivers, there are very many examples now of sewage companies discharging not only human excrement, into the rivers, but then all sorts of other effluvia coming from agriculture and industry, as well, to the point where when you go to rivers like the Liza, Ennerdale, and you look down into its crystal clear gin depths, and you see the colonies of hundreds of thousands of pearl mussels still sitting there on their beds as they have been doing in position since the last ice age, that you think there's something wrong with it. At the end of the day, that's the way the world should be. It's not exceptional. It's entirely natural. And when you look at the corridors, the canals, the transport systems which are wet, but essentially just got to, carry, all manner of toxic sludge through their course out to the sea, then you're looking at something that's entirely artificial and generated by us. We do things that are absurd. We take a landscape and decide that we're going to eliminate one guild of creatures that are going to potentially impact upon another guild of creatures that we want to kill. And when you start to think about our relationship in the British Isles, which I've been doing just recently, because once the Beavers book was done and finished, I have another couple of books to undertake, and one of them is going to be a history of the wolf in Britain, which is proving to be far more absorbing than I thought it would be at the beginning. But when you actually look at the history of this animal and you consider what we did to it, then what you actually have is a perfect circle of death. You have us deciding that if there are big animals that impact upon us, we're definitely going to not have those in the wider landscape, so they've got to die. If it's a medium-sized animal that one day might eat a chicken, then that also we can't have here, so they've got to die. There are other animals that we want to keep because we want to shoot them or we want to chase them up and down the landscape with hounds when it suits us, dressed in comedy costumes with funny horns and fancy hats. And anything that's sort of like that impacts upon those animals, obviously they've got to die too. And in the end, when we're near to completing this perfect circle of death, we go and shoot the ones we preserved. It doesn't make a lot of sense. When we start to think about natural systems and we look at the hills covered with purple heather and sheep, then we're looking at nothing that's natural at all. Just the other day I was reading in the Times an article from Annette Batters, who's the president of the National Farmers Union, who was assuring people that if you withdrew the subsidies that farmers received more or less since the Second World War for just simply existing, then what would happen is you would have people driven from the land. It would be, you'd basically destroy Aboriginal cultures and ancient languages. I'm, as you could probably guess, Scottish. And in the 1760s, a thing started called the Highland Clearances, after the Battle of Culloden, which broke the clan system up, this complex intertwining of individual responsibility. So you had feus and duties to your lords, all sorts of things that supported communities. What cleared the people from the hills that are now bare are the southern sheep for southern landlords that are still there and have grazed the remains of the old people's cottages and farm towns right into the ground. The dispossession was not something that basically was acceptable as far as the communities were concerned, because of course they went to Canada, North America and Australia. But this idea that there was somehow, by removing these sheep, dispossessing people that were there, have been there for a considerable length of time, is complete and utter nonsense, and we know it. We've created landscapes. Last summer I went up to look at Ennerdale in the Lake District. I don't know if anybody's ever been there, but it was to see whether the valley was a suitable environment for beavers. And we stood with the guys from the Forestry Authority who told us at the top of the valley that trees were never going to grow again, because the wind blows in from the west, and when it blows in from the west, it takes the seed with it. And even if you take the sheep away, they're saying that without planting, you might be thousands of years away from these forests forming again. We have created in many parts of upland Britain a landscape that's nearly ice age. There are no rabbits there, there are no white hares there, there are very few deer, there are very few grouse, there are a few crows. So when we start to talk about rewilding, and we think of the potential, look at these vast empty areas and say, well, couldn't there be eagles there of golden or white-tailed hue? You forget there's no food. And if there's no food, there's nothing for these big birds and animals to live on, and they will not survive. And indeed, that was the history of the golden eagles in the Lake District, which basically in the end starved to death because we'd taken all the food from the wider environment. Maybe in the end we're going to have to look at the Ice Age animals that were here and say that if we're going to be bold and adventurous and we've created Ice Age landscapes, then let's bring the marmots back and the hamsters and the reindeer And in the end, if the climate warms to the point where the forests grow again, they in their own right will fail. But in the medium term, something like a marmot is the size of an average-sized poodle, and if you're an eagle, it's a very good thing to eat. These are the kind of landscapes that we drive through every day and we think of as being normal. They're angular, they're organized, in complete entirety by us. And though I've worked with the most marvelous range of species, I've been very lucky to live a life that's involved me in their conservation. I can tell you that for many, we're just trying to jam them in to tiny areas of space that we don't want for a whole host of different reasons. And we're doing it maybe in some cases and as an exercise in hope that they'll find a way that we can't see to live there. And they will make their way and it will be a success. But space for wild creatures is simply not there in our landscape now in great abundance. It exists in things called nature reserves, areas that we identify, perhaps because they had a past industrial use or a past forest use or a past farming use that is now gone. And we say, well, I'll tell you what, we're going to make these areas nature reserves. They're going to be special. That's where the last of the magpie moths can live or whatever else. The last of the sand lizards, the last of the dormice. But they're small, isolated areas which are commonly not interconnected to each other. And we know from survey after survey that's been undertaken that if you look forward to a time when they're going to be all that's left, then the populations of things that they've been set up to preserve simply can't survive when they're separated from the wider landscape and other populations of the same type, if indeed they exist, by us. We have dominated this island since the Bronze Age. So perhaps for 7,000 years, 6,000 years, we've been the dominant land force. Anything that opposed us didn't die gently somewhere in its sleep. We made huge efforts to ensure that we destroyed them. And in destroying them, we didn't destroy them calmly or logically. We burnt them. We did all manner of things to these creatures because they took something from us. And when we killed them, we wanted to make sure we luxuriated in their deaths. And the evidence is all there from the past, from the old accounts, to ensure that if you look for it, you'll find these truths. It is shocking to consider that, in that time, that 7,000-year period, there are still some people in society who think that was right and who think it's what should have been and should still be, and who will do this to an eagle because one day it might take a grouse or a lamb. Until we move our mindset away from this idea that we are almost some sort of evangelical planetary force with the right to kill and slaughter wherever it suits us at any time, we can never reforge a relationship that's meaningful with nature. We don't know much about what was before we destroyed it. There are, of course, if it's a big animal, if it's an animal that took sheep or an animal we wanted to hunt, then there will be records. But when it comes to the tiny animals, we know very little. So things like tree frogs, for example. If you look at the earliest writers in the 1600s, they will tell you of a little frog of a brilliant parrot green that sits on trees and bushes and sings very beautifully. But it's a tiny thing, it's that size. You're not going to find a fossilized one. You're not going to find a mandible. You're not going to find any evidence at all. And the great steaming swamps they used to occupy in the east of England are all long gone. They're not even a folk memory anymore. So we have so cleanly wiped the slate of what was that we cannot see anymore what we actually destroyed. So when it comes to landscapes, those of you who have watched the Lorax will know that there's a revelationary point halfway through where the wee hero mounts himself on his quad bike, races up to the wall, knocks it over, and the people all come to the edge of the village. They think, oh my God. And we always think that oh my God bit is something that happens in other lands with other creatures and other people. That oh my God bit is here right now. It's knocking at the door. I've met some amazing people in the time I worked in nature conservation, like Carl Jones, who had this idea that you could take these utterly desecrated Mauritian atolls where the passing merchant ships had introduced rats and goats and rabbits that had taken the land down to its skeleton. and that you could kill all these animals that had been introduced there and start to reintroduce a fauna that once was. But all that was left there were the tiniest of skinks, some very small boas, a lot of introduced plant species, and a very few seeds and adult plants of the actual plant species that had been formerly native. It was literally rebuilding a world. And that, again, I would suggest, when you look at the state of our nature, which we're one of the most nature-depleted landscapes there is on Earth. We're 133rd out of a league table of 147. It's pretty much where we are today. And marvellous men like Carl show that it can be done. When he started his career as a young man, and he's a very old grouchy one now, he was working with this bird called the Mauritian kestrel. And in the 1970s, they were told, when there were only 8 of them left, or 3 of them left, or whatever tiny number it was, that the birds were done. It was all over. They were irrecoverable. They were going to become extinct, even though they were living and breathing, and the best thing to do was let them die with dignity. And he said no. And what he did was he took those birds and he applied avicultural and falconry rearing techniques to them. He took the eggs away from the birds that were still laying in the wild, so they laid another clutch. He manipulated them in all sorts of different ways. And in his lifetime, and it's not over yet, he reared and released somewhere in the region of 333 Mauritian kestrels, to the point where the bird now is a common bird, a very seeable bird, where it exists in Mauritius today. What you always find, guys, when you sit here in an audience and listen to people like me blagging on, is that there is going to be no cavalry coming. Do not expect the government or other organizations to sort anything out. At the end, the future is always changed by individuals like him, and maybe individuals like you. I sat last year at Cambridge University through a presentation about this bird. This is a Bartailed Godwit. There is a population, or there was a population, of approximately 40 pairs of these breeding over in the Nene Washes. Every year, the flooding of the Nene Washes is an unpredictable thing, and because this is the only breeding population of them that was left in Britain, it was decided that what they should do is, again, double clutch the birds. Is go there, take the first clutch away, rear them, so that double the number of Godwits were produced every year. Now, I spoke to Jeff Hilton from the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust the other day, and he tells me it's working very well. And the young birds they're rearing in polytunnels in captivity, after they've been incubated by the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, are reintegrating out into the wild flocks without any great problem, and that it's looking bright. But you're still looking at a population that's gone maybe from 44 pairs to maybe 100 pairs. They're not living right the way through the landscape. They can't. There is no space. There's nowhere for them. And at this presentation in Cambridge, I think it was either last year or the year before last, I forget about COVID, the girl that was in charge of the programme said they had a very, very wet season that year in the Nene Washes. The birds hadn't been able, they'd nested in the areas where they normally nested, which they've had to fence to protect from badgers and foxes, which would otherwise kill them. And that because the floods had come late, they'd all been flooded off their nests, all the eggs were gone, the birds had come in to try and lay a second clutch, and as soon as they tried to lay a second clutch, they were out in the arable fields, in the mud of the turned over soil, trying to nest there. And she said, we were out there with spoons, with some of the farmers helping us pick these eggs out of the ground, and some of them were crying when they did it. And these are not people who are sympathetic with regard to nature. This is what we've come to. This is where we are. And when you look across a broad guild of species, it's a profoundly shocking position to be in. This is the last population there is of freshwater peril mussels in Wales. That's it. These things are microscopic. I mean, you need to put them in a microscope to sit down and look at these tiny mussels that it's taken something like 5 years to get to that stage. These things live for 100 years. Remember what I said earlier on about Ennerdale. They've been there since the last ice age, living in pure, clear water, filtering it as bivalves in their gigantic colonies. They're all gone because they can't stand the toxic sludge anymore, the toxins, the poisons, the chemicals, the pesticides that agriculture delivers every year out into the watercourses. Even where they do survive in other Welsh rivers, they survive as 1 or 2 individuals clinging to a single stone, perhaps, while all around them in the sludge, the cadavers of their comrades lie buried. Crayfish too, they're working with, a species that has declined tremendously because, of course, we brought in, for farming purposes, exotic crayfish species which carry crayfish plague and which were cheap to import, cheap to rear, created a market that flourished for a very short period of time and then all fell apart. And the industry that created this market walked away, as the guys in the fur trade did, from mink and left the problem for everybody else to deal with for all eternity. Rewilding. Rewilding is an entertaining idea. I'm rewilding my farm. It's only 300 acres. We're finishing the ring fence on the second farm today, and within the next wee while, we'll be moving some more wild boar and various other animals into the ring fence to enable a panoply of horses, cattle, wild boar in very low numbers, and perhaps water buffalo if they behave themselves, to start changing the land. To start taking the areas that are flat and ploughed and have been cultivated to create something that's a high sward, a low sward, where there are big piles of warm rocks that we put back in after maybe 2,000 years of people destoning it to create crevices for the wheat ears that pass over us from Dartmoor every year, going home to Africa in the autumn, coming back to breed in the spring. We're going to do something completely different with that farm. If you look in the media, people will tell you, well, it's just too much. Big animals are dangerous running round countrysides like ours, and they're right. There are things that we can do, and there are things that we're going to have to be a bit more sensible about. Because if you hit a moose in your small smart car doing 60 on the A30 past Honiton, you're going to have to hope and pray that when it comes in through the windscreen, it's dead. Because if it isn't dead, in the last few bleeding seconds of life you and the moose are going to have, it's going to kick you to death. And that's a horrible way to go. There are realities when it comes to living with big mammals, big ungulates in landscapes like ours. But we know those realities. And it may be that as the support for agriculture fades and dwindles, that there are big areas of the land where we can erect fences and put these great animals that sculpt landscapes on a huge scale into very large pens to let them perform their purpose, their earth function. And that's how we should be thinking. The idea that out there, we have uplands where you have alpine meadows like this. Well, people will tell you it's so, and that when you look at farming in Wales, it's a process of transient agriculture with people bringing animals from the lowlands to the highlands, farming them, taking back down. Guys, that finished in the time of the Highland clearances and probably before it. What you've got up there are way too many sheep, no trees, a hard compacted soil, a heather cover which, if it's still there, is declining every year. I went out with a colleague of mine to look at buying a bit of Brentmoor on Dartmoor when it was up for sale in the spring of this year, and in the sunny afternoon we spent there on 3,000 acres. We saw one lizard with half a tail, 4 or 5 crows, 2 meadow pipits, and 6 toads in the river on our way home. And that was it. That's what it's come to. Don't think there's a wilderness out there. Of course we need farming, but we need farming in a different way. We need farming that's resilient, that basically relies on the animals to create their own fertility. We need to take steps back from the chemical process, from industrial agricultural systems we created, which don't really benefit us, because in the end, the soils they destroy and the rivers that they ravage are things that we're all going to have to pay for and that we can't exist with. At the end of it all, when you get to the point where the soil is just a medium where it will not function without chemicals and pesticides, it's inert and dead. So we've gone from killing the big animals that opposed us to killing the tiny, tiny, tiny ones and the mycelium as well. It's not sustainable. It can't work. And there are things we can do. Now, nature conservation I've worked in for most of my life. There are 1 or 2 people I think I might know here, and at the risk of offending anybody, we're not good at nature conservation. Nature conservationists, in my experience, talk too much. We fill in too many reports, we tick too many boxes, cross too many T's, dot too many I's. It's all a heap of shit. What we need to be doing is considering the fact that we live in a time of international climate, global extinction emergency, and acting fast. We need to think like farmers. If you turned around to them and said, I'll tell you what, for every wildcat you produce, I'll give you 150 quid. Before you knew where you were, you'd be knee-deep in them. Cat fighting, happily, mating, having sex. But at the end of the day, You know, nature conservation, we don't think like that. We think of cosy little projects. We think of our PhD students. We think of our careers and our reputations and the organisations we want to build with big offices and lush, thick carpets, electric vehicles sitting outside. Those things become our priorities, and those things are misplaced and wrong. We need to look at doing this as a slim operation, something that's slick and fast and that delivers, not something that builds us as individuals or the organisations we work for. And we need to think, you know, with an open mind. We'll have a look at beavers in a minute. We'll have a chat about beavers in a minute. But what beavers do is beavers change landscapes. They're nature's force that makes the land wet and very complicated. We have, ever since we stood on our hind legs and our tails dropped off when we left Africa, we've been focused on dominating the land, drying it out, pushing the water to the edge of the fields we want, and ensuring that everything is dry and cultivatable. They oppose us very fundamentally. But in the landscapes they create, that you have such a myriad of living environments, dead trees, sunken timber, open grassy lawns, deep ponds, shallow ponds, that they keep on making more and more, that a whole host of life comes in to inhabit them. And you get an 80% greater density of frogs, for example, an 80% greater density of insects, for example, or fish fry in beaver-generated landscapes because of this complexity than you do in landscapes where they don't exist. And what they're doing is they're resetting the table of life, because these frogs, these moor frogs, northern pool frogs, whatever, they're not important in their own right. They're just food. It's like going into Nando's and selecting your frog. At the end of the day, if you're a herd and you're not worrying about, you know, whether it's a species that's endangered or not, all you're interested in doing is stuffing it down your throat. We live in a time when marvellous things have happened, when good people have tried very hard to do some remarkable things with the most incredible species. If you are not already a member of the Great Bustard Trust, and you jolly well should be, and you should go and see Dave Waters on Salisbury Plain, who for decades in his life has tried terribly hard to restore a bustard population which is on the cusp of breeding now in Britain after something like 20 years of effort. A difficult bird, hard to obtain, a difficult bird to rear, never been tried before. There are more bustards running around Salisbury Plain now than there are in many of the range state countries where they never became extinct. As I said earlier on, nature needs individuals who are strong and persuasive and determined, and David is certainly that. I will tell you something of the beaver. I've worked with beavers, I think, probably for a quarter of a century or more. When I started to work with them, nobody was interested. Some old guys who were dying or dead had looked at the possibility of reintroducing them before, and they had all failed. We were told, when I was told, along with a few of us that started, when we began, it was an animal that had gone a long time ago. It was always very rare. It was just a pointless thing to do. Utter waste of time. Focus on dormice or something more sensible instead. And the more I've had to do with this creature, the more I've learnt that I know nothing about it. And that the more you seek to have something to do with it, then the more you understand just a little. But it is a creature, quite simply, which is a force of life. It creates living space for all the other creatures that inhabit the wetlands, and a very broad range of species that we don't think of as wetland creatures live there. William Harrison, who was one of the authors of the Elizabethan Vermin Act, said that when he rewrote his section of the Act, I must tell you something of the beaver. In shape of its body, it's like a giant rat. It has such force in its teeth it can shear through a double billet or a plank in a night. He was very impressed by the force of these creatures. And they are truly remarkable. Gentle, social, humble animals that take great care of their offspring, their one-year-old babies. They live in colonies and territories that are actually, in very many ways, as the North American Indians perceived them, very similar to us. Until the settlers came to North America, not many of the tribes killed beavers at all. If they wanted a particularly soft skin for an instrument or a valuable knife or a possession, then yes, they might. But when they did that, they would take parts of the animal, return it to the water, and they would ensure that the dogs of the village, which they considered to be the lowest of creatures, were not able to feed on what was left of the beaver. because they consider them to be the architects of the Earth's kidneys around which all life revolved. They had respect for these animals. As soon as the colonists come, a new way of thinking emerges, and we'll come back to that later. This is the kind of chaos they create. They come into what was a commercial forestry plantation. They block the drainage outflows that were put in, perhaps in the 1950s, and the whole thing turns back once more into a swamp. The conifers that were planted there don't like living in a swamp, and they die and they fall over. And they provide a huge amount of deadwood and gantries for things like stoats to hunt the frogs and mink to come in and try and take the water voles. So what you get is a great complication in life that was never there before. You have things like this, that root plate over there, where kingfishers nested, in which wagtails and solitary bees would use. All manner of life follows the beaver, and without the beaver you cannot recover nature. It's as simple as that. It's a very, very easy thing to understand, no complexity there at all. And what I've seen in time, though I'm only seeing tiny parts, are some of the relationships that they used to have with animals and birds and insects and amphibians that are still British, reforming in tiny part because these creatures are returned. This is a beaver up in a place next to Langorse Lake in an enclosure at a friend's farm. It lives in a large alder woodland with its mate and its babies. And this bird, the little grebe, has had 2 clutches of chicks on the lake this year. As soon as that beaver comes out of its lodge at night, it's a shallow lake, and there's a lot of leaf detritus on the bottom. The movement of the big animal just makes the leaves in the bottom undulate. And when the leaves in the bottom undulate, the insects, the aquatic invertebrates that the little grebe is looking for, rise. And the grebe is more or less following the beaver, sitting on its bum, just dipping off to either side of the big animal when it moves without concern through this water world, catching the invertebrates easily they would otherwise have to hunt very hard to obtain. That relationship is not a new one. It didn't form last week or last year. That relationship formed millennia ago. This is a 40-million-year-old species, and all other life understands it well. It's only us ignorant who've forgotten. The frogs that would once have filled the beaver wetlands, we've exterminated. There are pool frogs in Britain, but they're in 5 small, very carefully supervised colonies. We have species action plan targets saying, well, they're going to be there and nowhere else. They're just food. It's only a frog. They should be everywhere. We should be paying farmers to breed them in bucket loads and dump them in with JCBs. So the swamps of the future, if we ever allow them to re-emerge, are full of things, full of these water frogs that always exist around the edge of a water body, where things can eat them at leisure during the day. And we need to start thinking again about how we understand creatures we thought we knew very well. This creature is a female sand lizard. A number of years ago, I was in Bavaria, and we encountered one basking on top of a beaver dam on a fairly grey day. She didn't like being there. She didn't like us photographing her. But this is a species we always think of as existing in sand dune systems or on heathlands like the ones that encircle Dorchester and nowhere else in the country at all. This one was nowhere near heathland. It was right in the middle of Germany on the Austrian border. And as we walked in, eventually when she became fed up with us, she just slipped off the top of the beaver dam, disappeared down like a marina di Diana into its depths. Eventually, after we'd looked aghast for a second and convinced ourselves we'd killed her, she popped up again on a floating piece of wood that was out in the water, crawled onto the wood, lay there, flattened her body and started to bask. And the biologists we were with said, well, they always do this. There's nothing unusual in any of this because the insects land there, and it's very easy for her, A, to avoid predators there when she's so exposed, and B, to catch the insects that are sitting right next to her. Our knowledge of animals that we think we understand in detail, that we've written huge reports about with regard to their ecology and lifestyle, we don't understand these creatures at all. And we're going to have to rethink this relationship and this understanding if we're going to make a better world. And beavers produce surprises. Nature is not something that operates on the basis of forms ticked and filled in, T's crossed and I's dotted. That's not the way it works. It's a much more random and rugged and special and intrepid thing. This bird is a black stork. Black storks are almost certainly a former breeding British species that we killed so long ago we can barely find the bones of them from the Pleistocene. About 3 years ago, a colleague of mine was working on a project in Scotland, studying the fish in a stream where there were beaver dams and the fish in the stream where there were no beaver dams. It meant he had to run lots and lots of trail cameras, and he kind of ran out of time halfway through his PhD for personal reasons, which meant that sort of for a week he was sitting in a very, very dull office, just looking at one bit of grass waving, clicking the computer button, looking at another bit of grass waving, clicking the computer button, and then all of a sudden you turn it on, and there's this bird fishing in a beaver dam in Scotland where it hasn't fished as a species for perhaps the last 1,500 years. These birds in Belgium have recovered fast on the back of the restoration of the beavers in the Ardennes, where once there were none, there are now over 80 breeding pairs, and they're overflying Britain now. If we allow the beavers to regenerate the landscapes they need, dark pool systems and forests with big trees where they can nest in peace and rear their young, they will come again. We will have some of the most brilliant surprises that we simply can't predict. This bird, a redback shrike, the butcher bird, you read the Observer's Book of Birds, it's here in the 40s and 50s, a common wee bird of scrub, feeding on beetles and lizards and amphibians and impaling them on the thorns of the tree it lives amongst. The last ones that tried to breed in Britain were a pair on Dartmoor 3 years ago where the spring was cold and wet. And I spoke to the girl from the Forestry Commission who was in charge of the project, and she said we were going to start feeding those chicks and crickets from pet shops because there were so few insects on the whole of Dartmoor for a bird that size. But then they died anyway. And there are none of them here anymore. If we want to bring birds like this back, we're going to have to reintroduce them. When I spoke to Rebecca about it, and she told us that story, I was with a German ecologist who said, but these birds live right the way through the beaver-generated wetlands. There are 4 pairs just round the corner because the wetlands are full of dragonflies and big beetles and frogs and lizards and newts and all manner of different things they can feed upon. We've just got it wrong. Our understanding of where this bird would have been when its world was the right place to live in is wrong. I've worked with water bulls. I've bred, 26,000. 28,000 for reintroduction projects the length and breadth of Britain. From the Cairngorms in the north to the Welsh coast in the west, from the English Channel in the east, to the Isle of Wight. I'm not winning. When I started to work with this species in 2004, it was estimated there was a national population of 1.4 million. And these guys, again, are the basis of the food chain. They're clean, their blood is clean, they're not full of rodenticides, they weigh 330 grams, and every male field vole only weighs 30. So it's the Big Mac of the vole world. But the most recent estimate of their population numbers suggests that they only number 77,000 now. They are functionally extinct. They are feeding a few things, but all the wonderful complexities they create in riverbanks with their tunnels and runs, sunning areas for grass snakes, refugias for other small mammals and reptiles, they're all going too. The randomness of the seed dispersal of the plants, the latrines they create underground, which create nutrient-rich pockets which allow different plants to prospect and which we can't see, that's all going to finish very, very soon. Beavers, why did we kill them? Well, we killed them for a variety of different reasons. The stupid Roman Catholic Church said they were fish because they had scaly tails, and therefore you could eat them on fast days when you couldn't eat the fast of any other land mammal. They're about the size of a Labrador, so there's a lot of meat in a beaver. We use their fur, and we'll come to that in just a second. But principally, in Europe and Eurasia, we were killing them for these things, these castor glands that the animal is offering up to a hunter because it was believed in the Middle Ages that this was the animal's testicles, and that if it offered them to a hunter, the hunter would spare its life and allow it to live free. That, of course, didn't happen, and, of course, they're not as testicles, but it shows you how belief based on nonsense actually forms. They were known right the way through the Middle East, so the Eurasian beaver, which is the form you find here, was once found from Britain up into the edge of the Arctic Circle, down into the Mediterranean rim of Europe, and over right the way as far east as China and Korea. They had all sorts of different names, but one of the common names when you translate what the Iranians called them, and the Persians and the Syrians, it was the water dog. There was huge confusion about what the animals actually were. So when these people start to talk about water dogs, you can see you've got an illustration of a medieval illustration of a kind of dog-headed creature. It's got a fish's tail because, of course, people are still thinking about Catholic fast days. So there's real confusion about the animal. And even though people understand that the castoreum, which it comes from this animal, it's incredibly valuable, I should have said, because where beavers eat willow, the castoreum contains a very high quantity of silicic acid. And silicic acid is a very important ingredient of aspirin, so it works as a very effective painkiller and was all used for all sorts of different medieval reasons. But the long and the short of it was confusion about the animal itself. It was a trade item. Castoreum was moved, right the way through the Silk Roads and all the other major trading routes from Castoria and Greece through to the old Byzantine towns. But the animals were killed in huge numbers to afford this trade. At different times, there were people, before the birth of Christ who understood that killing a beaver would produce drought and that corn and grass would cease to grow until the killer of the beaver received punishment. And they would fine the killers of beavers, maybe 60,000 dirhams and tell them they had to go out and kill 10,000 tortoises and snakes to make up for their sins. They understood full well how important this animal was. And we've forgotten it all. We don't know when the last beavers in Britain were actually killed. There are bounty records for the payment of a head in 1789, but there are also records that say, well, other heads were paid for between 1789 and 1904, and we simply haven't found them. But this lady here, Kathleen, the older lady on the walking apparatus, says that she can remember seeing them in the stream beneath the bridge that we were standing over at a place called Wentworth Woodhouse on the southern side of the Humber when she was a young girl in the 1930s. It's possible they may have lingered very long. But like the beaver, where we now are, even though we understand everything there is to understand about it, we understand how important it is, how much life relies on it, how much of a role it plays in water purification. When we've put all the chemicals in and the water flows through their wetlands, where you have natural filters full of sphagnum moss and vegetative detritus and dams that trap 80% of the silts that are lost to diffuse agricultural pollution, even when we understand how important all this is, we're turning round in a time of knowledge and saying to the guys in Scotland on the Tay that none of this matters. You just kill them because it stops your carrots growing, because you've got a blockage in a ditch, because your big tractor sunk into a wet hole that was only drained over the course of the last 50 years. The only solution is you kill them. And history shows us that at every time we turn round to people who still hate, that abominations happen. You have proclamations which tell you you're going to start paying for the scalps of the Penobscots. You have people in chains because these people are something that are opposing what you want to do. And history shows us every time when we have a people that exist on the frontiers of reality, building a new world, or the frontiers of thought, and you give them the ability to kill, you tell them it's okay, that it becomes unstoppable and abominations happen, and it's just wrong. Because at this time, when there are very few of these creatures living in the British Isles, we shouldn't be killing a single one. They're valuable. We can't import them anymore because of the pain we've inflicted on ourselves through Brexit. No more imports of wild animals or domestic animals. That's it. It's finished. We can't get any more from Germany or France or anywhere else where they're common. And what we're doing in Scotland is just creating a situation whereby we delay the day when they could be out on the rivers of Dorset or Wiltshire or Cornwall or Devon doing very much more good for all of us. So when we move forward in a time in understanding, there are those amongst us in society who would drag us unequivocally back. And we know what happens when you remove them, not in ancient times, but in modern times too. The New World is indeed still very new. And when we arrived there in the late 1600s as traders, we're going there to trade for fur because we've so depleted the European and Eurasian fur markets that it's a commodity which is becoming increasingly expensive, increasingly controlled by international treaties and trade guilds. In the New World, it's all there for the taking. And we see it. There are some people who, in the end, when the killing was all over, and the beavers in North America had been destroyed and taken down from a population of perhaps 120 million to maybe somewhere in the region of 5 or 6, who said no more and who acted well before their time in the 1920s and 30s and made cine films about what the beavers did, about the landscapes they created, about how all other wildlife was dependent on the beavers. And these early cine films were shown to the kings and queens of Europe, and people like Archie Bellany, who made this myth of grey owl in his lifetime, did very much to set up and establish the basis for the Canadian National Park Service, and to ensure that as part of that, the beaver and a number of other animals, at least for a time, were protected from those that would do them down. There are other people like Eric Collier, another trapper, who went out into the Chilcotin Basin in Canada, convinced that he would make a living from trapping the fur-bearing animals that were there to keep his family and to build a ranch. And when he got there on his first day, he witnessed forest fires racing from range to range of pine through the valley bottoms, which would once have been wet, where all the beavers were and had all been killed, doing tremendous damage, drying out the rangelands, so that the range cattle basically went to the last of the beaver dams where the beavers had been gone for 50 years and where only mud remained, and trying to drink there through the hot summer months, trample their fellows into the dirt until all that was left was rotten and putrid. It's been seen. We know what happens. We know that from the Mediterranean basin in the time of Pliny, when he was pleading for the Roman governors to stop the cutting down of the forests, that we disregarded that and the land went back to its skeleton. That's what happens when you take out the creatures that save the water. And while we're preoccupied almost entirely by flooding in the west and slowing the flow and making sure that towns and settlements are protected because we so drained the landscape for farming that we've ignored the end repercussions of this, we forget that in the east of England there's less of an allocatable headage of water per individual of human being that's living there than there is now in Sudan. I've spoken to many people involved in the conservation of the beaver. I've seen many grand strategies form. I've seen people at the top of their organisations tell me they have a vision of the future which they're going to deliver. You have to be careful with people who have visions. If you want an example of that, in the 9th century BC, the Roman governor in charge of Germania decided that he was going to basically conquer an area of the Hurtigan forest. And he led his 20,000 troops out into that forest, knowing, with his own centurions telling him, that the German legionaries in his army had betrayed himself to the Germans. Over the course, he did not believe the people who told him this, and over the course of 4 days, 20,000 of his people died while the rain poured down incessantly. It took the Romans 5 years to bury their dead, so stacked in piles were they in the forest. And after they'd launched a series of brutal, punitive raids, they departed, never to come back again. Beware of people with visions. The visions don't always work out in the way you thought. We live in a time now where this sort of shit is common, where we try to do something that should be pure and straightforward and clear. And before you know where you are, some wee person or tiny committee with no function at all, sitting in an office, tell you that before you put 2 beavers on a Pen and Enfield, you've got to do all this, okay? So we've got to, I don't know what we've got to do. We've got to talk to Thames Water and make sure that a dead beaver doesn't block the outflow of some critical drinking water pipe in London if they ever get out of their pen. If a badger falls into the reservoir, it's absolutely okay. There's nothing you can do about that. It could decompose in the outflow, but a beaver, no. We've got to talk to the guys that responsible, the highways agents who are responsible for the M25 in case a beaver escapes and tries to cross the motorway. But we don't have to worry about the fallow deer that do so every day, or the pygmy goats that might from the farm next door, or a cow or a horse or anything else. And by the time you finish, this soaks so much time. It's not an easy thing to go through. And what you find is for these rodents, their bosses, you know, the ones with a vision, remember them, they support them right the way down the line. They're not interested in results. What they're interested in doing is preserving their own existence and making sure they have a function in life still to perform. It's not a good place to be, and it's ridiculous that in a time of emergency, when you'd be saying, hey, it's an emergency, run like hell, act fast, that we're doing this sort of nonsense. There are other things we should have a conversation about as well. We get worried about death. Death is life. At the end of it all, when you look at the environments we occupy, which are sterile and straight and neat and tidy, as a nation of gardeners, we think it's right. But then what's wrong about the idea that some of the ponies that live up in Dartmoor, when they die or we shoot them because there are way too many of them, they shouldn't just decompose and feed the birds of the air and the carrion beetles and a whole manner of other things that would take the goodness of their bodies back down into the soil from which it came and return that goodness to where it should be. Because when you look at remarkable things happening, like the lammergeiers, these great bearded vultures, the bone breakers from the Alps, where successful reintroduction projects have so restored them that eventually they're wandering over to our barren island just to see what's here, when they come with their gigantic wingspans and their abilities to go up into the sky and drop bones down into rocks so they can break them open and feed on their marrow, all they encounter here are a few squashed pheasants, an odd grey squirrel that's committed suicide, and a rabbit or two. That's it. Welcome to Britain. Please don't leave. But they do. We live in a time as well when things like this are happening, when the organisations like the Vincent Wildlife Trust and others are taking these wee woodland sprites that we hammer down. Genetic studies suggest that perhaps less than 40, 50 animals in the far northwest of Scotland, and they're reintroducing them to the Vale of the Rydal and to the Forest of Dean and to a variety of other locations now. And when they come, other relationships start to reform too. Red squirrels are adapted to pine martens. Grey squirrels are not. Where they live in North America, there are no martens. And therefore, when they're slumbering in their wee nests at night, safe and secure, they've never been in a position where something climbs that tree and pulls their heads off. And when you look at what's happened from the studies over in the Rydal, not only are they consuming grey squirrels in very large numbers, those grey squirrels know that something's gone wrong, and they're running like hell. So, and in doing that in Scotland and in Ireland, and perhaps one day soon in Wales, the red squirrel populations, which have done so terribly badly, that at the point of just fading near utterly from the landscape, have started to recover. We have no ecosystems left. If we want to do better, we're going to have to intervene. And we're going to have to look at some of the old things we never considered doing before and start to do them with great gusto and with great speed. Roy Dennis, the most remarkable man. He's the old guy there. Look, that one that's grinning in a sort of inane fashion. But in his long, long life, he's 80-odd years now, he's been instrumental in reintroducing the white-tailed eagle to Scotland and now to the Isle of Wight. He's been instrumental in reintroducing birds back to their Scottish range, like the osprey, and its English range too. He is the most marvellous thinker, marvellous man, marvellous speaker. Not the kind of guy that drives a big car. Not the kind of organisation that has a CEO. These are people that take small amounts of money and they bloody do things with it. And that's why we're standing here today and we're going to give the loot to them. Because you know it'll be well spent. It won't just vanish into some pot where somebody one day has a Christmas party. They'll actually do something with it that's meaningful. They're incredibly admirable people. This is my farm. It's looking like a bit of a mess. My next door neighbours are having a bit of a hissy fit about it because they say that corn used to grow there. 25 years ago, all you'd hear in the surrounding landscape when everybody else is cutting silage is the guys that rented that ground at the same time cutting silage too. We're going to make a difference. It's not a big difference. It's only 300 acres. But we're going to show people that if you take your land and look at the animals not as being the producers of beef or the producers of milk or hide or horn, but the producers of architecture, of living space in everything they do. Every wallow they create hosts dragonflies. Every shit they produce feeds dung beetles. Every time the grey flies swarm, they draw down their chemical clean blood. And then the birds feed on them. We're going to take this wee bit of land and we're going to show that if you're willing to take risks and you're willing to try, that you can change things. And there are many, many people who are now buying farms. Indeed, Savills today announced that the fact that something like 48% of people that are now buying farmland are buying it for other purposes with no farming money. And one of the common purposes is rewilding. It's still a small movement. It's only maybe 50,000 acres out of a farmed landscape of 23 million. But that 23 million is entirely supported by taxpayers' money. And when that finishes, in the next year and a half, there is going to be no financial basis left for that system to continue. And then a lot of other people are going to have to think very hard about what they're going to do. We still need food. We still need to produce everything we need from agriculture. But at the end of it all, if we took 1% of that land out of agricultural production, it would only take something like 3% of the calories out of the diets we consume. The idea we can't strike a balance and have a compromise between making other space for the other creatures that would still share this island with us if they had the opportunity, and farming is utter nonsense. We can do things that are tremendous. The Europeans have already showed us the way. If you were having a wander through the dunes of South Kemmerland, just beneath Amsterdam, maybe 40 miles away, 40 kilometres away from the city's municipal limits, and you look through the fence, well, you might see some of these guys there. They're there to create great sand wallows, so that sand lizards can lay their eggs in areas that have been opened by animals that would have opened them anyway, long, long ago, rather than by us with cultivators. They're there to provide pure blood. They're there to crunch down ancient roses, so that when these roses regrow, they don't grow as tall, straggling plants. They grow as carpets right the way across the sand. Things are possible. We can prove we're a clever ape. We can work miracles if we wish to do so, and if we don't tie ourselves in knots on the way to our end goals. I was involved with Charlie and Izzy in the initial imports of the white storks. The white storks have, as a bird in Britain, again almost certainly were a breeding bird, but were destroyed a very long time ago by us. Prompted a huge argument in nature conservation circles, which bitterly still goes on to this day. We weren't really interested in the idea of reintroducing another bird. What we wanted to do was get those distracted people in the worlds that they exist in, where nothing is real and where they're not connected to nature, to look at something like this, because one day these trusting birds, when they spread out in Ep Castle, are going to start nesting on the roof of your Aldis and your superstores and your bungalows and your churches, and one day there will be a pair on top of St. Paul's Cathedral or maybe on top of the Houses of Parliament. And they're noisy, and they fill your gutters full of shit, and they wake your kids up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you cannot ignore them. Those birds are symbolic of what that landscape should be. Are we going to have a landscape where there are living frogs and small mammals and crickets and dragonflies, where storks can live and breed and feed their goose-sized youngsters, or is everything going to always be dead? That's why those birds were put back at Nep. And it's amazing to see the footage of the squadrons of them now sailing down the south coast of England, which they haven't done in all likelihood for 2,500, maybe 4,000 years, and flying back off to Africa. We can do things in our lifetimes that are remarkable. One of the species that a colleague of mine is working on is the glowworm. If you speak to many of the old country people, they will tell you they remember them. And you'll speak to old farmers sitting in front of an aga at night, and when they're feeling a wee bit teary because they've had a hard day and another cow's just dropped down dead of calcium deficiency, and they'll say they remember where their grandfather took them to a wee bowl in the hedge that sits into a bank and watched the little twinkling lights going on and off. Mowing finishes them. They instar, the females do not move, the females are the ones that glow, and they have two instars which go down into the plant roots and into the soil. So even if you don't plough them, and even if you don't spray them with chemicals, where they exist in the road veggies and verges and hedge edges, if you cut them twice, you destroy all the grubs, and you turn out all the lights. And that's the end of them, and they never come back. We are going to breed these in captivity. We've had a few hiccups, but we'll get it right, and in the end, we want to be in a place where we can turn around to the schools around us and say, tell you what, why don't we go out with some jam jars and turn the lights on again? It's symbolically important. It's symbolically important to have hope, to get promise of a future that's better and to something that could be. And turning these wee tiny lights on could be a very good symbol of that. It's about the future. It's not just about us. We can sit in our cozy lives looking at what we have and just accept that we're okay. We're running out of time. I've spent a lot of time this year looking at rewilding projects the length and breadth of England. I've been to estates in the north where the habitat looks okay, and you'll walk through with a gamekeeper who will say, 40 years ago, never thought about the spotted flycatchers here. They were everywhere, catching insects in the strobes of sunlight that came through the woodland canopy. We never considered them at all. We didn't think about the pied flycatchers. We didn't think about the redstars. We didn't think about the 10-spine stickleback in the ditch at the bottom of the farm. We didn't think about the water voles. We didn't think about the curlews or the godwits or the ruffs. They are all gone. Every single last one of them. The chemicals started to finish them in the 80s, and the last 40 years have more or less done the job. Where things remain, they exist as shards and fragments. If we want to go forward to a better time, where our children don't inherit grey destruction, then our lives, we have to think about acting now. Kids' films, they always end with a happy ending. The baddies don't win. The big corporate pirates that would mine the island and steal all its trees or make its monkeys into handbags, they're not the guys that come good in the end, and they shouldn't. But we all know as adults that all too often in life, that's the way things actually are. So we're faced with a choice now. In the time that we live and draw breath, are we going to do good, or are we going to sit in our hands and just accept that there is nothing we can do and that it's going to slide the way it's going, and in the end we'll be left with a much diminished planet where in the end we won't be able to survive either, because we're not divorced from nature. We're very much part of it, and its future is ours. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, nature red in tooth and claw. Perhaps I should have warned you that there were some distressing images you were going to see in that film, but if you never took the case for rewilding seriously, and I know I haven't thought about it particularly deeply myself, hearing and seeing Derek Gow talk, I think may encourage you, as it has done me, to investigate it more and take it much more seriously as one of the options for land use in this country in the future. Now, we have, friends, we've got just over 20 minutes before we need to close this Zoom, and I'd love to hear from some of you about that. I don't know what struck you particularly during that film. I was fascinated myself to hear that the figures he quoted from Savills, the land agents, that large numbers of people now buying farming land are doing it with the intention of rewilding, to make small farms at least examples of this. So though there was quite a lot that was depressing and very bracing to think about in that film, that, as he said, there are things we can do. I love the idea of the white stalks on top of the Houses of Parliament. And for us here at Othona, glowworms are a particular concern and delight, because we still have a few glowworms in the grounds here. In the summer, this last year, we created down in our woodland a little glade with, because the land is sloping quite steeply there, we flattened out a piece of the land, a circular piece of the land, and created a little sort of story circle where we can sit around on bits of tree trunk and have a little fire pit in the middle. We're in the woodland, and it's a new space for people to gather in nature here. And the first evening that I took a family group of all ages down there, ready to light the fire and sit round, and we sang some songs. As we arrived, before the fire was lit, what did we discover but one glowworm lighting that glade for us? It doesn't light it, of course, but one glowworm, as it were, welcoming us in. That was a moment I won't forget at all. We have very few of them here. In years gone by, there were more. None of us can find out. We do not know why they're still declining in numbers. We now manage our land very much for biodiversity, and lots of other things have come back and proliferated, but so far the glowworms seem only to be just hanging on. It would be lovely to have them increasing again in number in the future. Now, I wonder who out there would like to comment on the film. There may be things that you take issue with, maybe things that were new to you, or things you didn't quite understand and you want to ask whether anybody else has knowledge of them. So if you want to comment, would you use the raising hand option? If you go to reactions on your screen and click there, it should give you a number of options, and you can hit the one that just raises a little yellow hand on the screen, and we'll know that you're wanting to have your say. Anybody there with something they'd like to feed in, having watched Derek Gow's presentation? His farm is in Devon, by the way. He's not that far away. Okay, Sue. I don't know which Sue it is. You don't. Oh, thanks. You've turned on your camera now. It's perfectly acceptable to speak without turning on your camera if, for some reason, maybe Sunday morning, some people are still in their pajamas. Sue, yes, let's hear from you.
Yes, I was struck by his comment that you couldn't expect to rewild the highlands just like that because the soil was all denatured now, and that the alpine flowers wouldn't come back if you just remove the pressure of grazing. And I guess that's true, and even more depressing, and just shows us how much work we have to do with rewilding. But then I thought of my own garden, where I just put some yellow rattle into the grass in one area of the lawn, and I decided that would be it, and I would just let any species that would come back, and effectively try to rewild a little minnow meadow within my lawn. And I'm up to 27 species now. And I don't think, the people who owned the house before me, he treated the garden with every chemical there was. He was, he even he put fungicides in the grass and all sorts, according to the neighbours. I've only been here 5 years, so I think nature will come back, and it is worth us doing, whatever we can really in our own gardens and things. I think it can come back. I'm in Purbeck, by the way, so, I suppose I am surrounded by fields, but they're all grazed, and there's not a lot of wildflowers in the fields around me. You've got to go right out to the coast before there are the wildflowers. But yeah, I know the birds have been very generous. They've brought seeds in, and yeah.
Thank you, Sue. Absolutely, and it's encouraging that one can do something even on a tiny scale. It's not going to bring big mammals back. You remember that cartoon of somebody who rewilded their front garden?
It's only 5 square meters. It's not only 5 square meters. It's a sunny spot, but yeah, it's not taking that long for it to come back.
Well, every little does help. It really does. We were talking, I think, yesterday evening. On our 4th session, I mentioned about the farmland, the National Trust owned farmland just surrounding Othona's grounds, and how that was intensively farmed up until about 1988, and therefore had lots of artificial fertilizer, presumably herbicides and pesticides as well, and was pretty useless ground at the end of that. And since that time, it's been, first of all, just left alone, and then managed from 1995 by the National Trust with organic grazing, just light grazing of it. And it's wonderful land now. A lot of species diversity has come back. I know one of the people out there in Zoom land with us this morning is Mart Tebbs. And Mart, I'd love to hear from you if you want to speak, because Mart did that, initiated that kind of process for our grounds here at Othona, which had parts of which had just been left with sort of benign neglect for ages, were still a bit wild, but other parts of which had been mown to within an inch of their lives on a regular basis. That was what people felt they should do and wanted to do at the time. I'm not having a go at them. but something like 20 years ago now, Mart, was it, that you started looking at our grounds in an entirely different way? Let's hear you speak.
Oh yes, I mean, we had a chap who used to mow all the grounds, and he mowed pretty ruthlessly everywhere, and that's what people seemed to want at the time. And then he retired and moved away, and there was a gap. And I remember we were at Bradwell, our other centre, one time, and people were asking us what we'd like to volunteer to try and do to help Othona. So I put my hand up, and it was probably, I don't know if it was a mistake or not.
It wasn't.
I put my hand up. I said I'd take on doing what Alec had done, but I wouldn't do it like Alec did it. I'd let it be what it wanted to be. But what I would do was make areas that people could sit in, mown grass, so that there was some play area, places where people could sit or play games. But the rest of it, as far as possible, I would leave unmanaged most of the year and then just do autumn clean-up of part of it. And I'd put in pathways, because one of the things you need to do is, if you want people to go and look at the flowers, is provide some pathways. Because if you don't, they walk all over everything and crush what's there. So it's important to have a system of access, and then you can go and show people what's there. My particular concern was insects, and providing, because I see them as right at the bottom of the food chain, really, in grassland, in that type of grassland. So I wanted to encourage insects of all types there. And a good indicator of when your insects are doing well is the number of lizards, slow worms, snakes, and nesting birds take up in the area. And I noticed over the years that has really taken off. We have a lot of those sorts of creatures about, which indicate the health of it. What we couldn't do was, of course, bring in big animals, because we did at one time years ago think about, we should have some little cattle in there, but then you've got all the problem of fencing off, etc. So the problem then is that you have to treat the grassland as if it's had cattle on it eating it. So you have to sort of, at certain times of the year, mow off parts of the top grass and take it away so the nutrients aren't going back into the ground. And then that will encourage smaller plants that normally would have to, they'd be deprived of light by overgrowth of grass. Luckily, in the last few years, since I've sort of retired from the job, we now have a chap called Maurice, and what he's doing is excellent. So it'll go.
He's very much carrying on in the tradition that you started, Mart. And
there's one thing else I'd like to say.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something else, which is not to do with our particular patch. Years ago, I lived in Devon, and I worked on a golf course there. And near to the golf course was a lake called Stover Lake. This is near Newton Abbot, with surrounding woodland. And Stover Lake had a flow through. There was a sort of a system of intake of water from ditching, and it would outflow under a bridge at the other end. And nearby was a haulage company's depot, and they kept a huge tank of fuel on site, and that leaked, and it got into the water system, and it completely killed everything in Stover Lake and all around it, all the birds, all the insects, everything, the plants. It was just a complete stinking mess of oil floating on the water. They had to come in and do a clean-up job as far as they could. Oil sank to the bottom as well, so it was in the mud underneath. But they did do a bit of a clean-up job. It wasn't totally satisfactory at all. But I have to say that within 2 years, you wouldn't know that that place had ever been killed off. It just totally recovered on its own.
Blimey.
Just like that. And the birds came back and the dragonflies came back. And it was just amazing. I was just totally gobsmacked at the power of the natural world to recover from total disaster, really, like that. And you see this around Chernobyl and other areas of the world where there's been...
There is a resilience in nature, isn't there? And when we're looking for resilience for ourselves, that sometimes comes through contact with the natural world and recognition that we are part of it, rather than trying to live a human life as if we were entirely separate from it and superior to it.
It's like people like Gary Snyder, who I much admire, and an American environmentalist, poet, etc. Very elderly now, he might even be dead, I'm not sure. But he always said, we are nature. We're not part of nature. Nature is not apart from us. We are nature.
Absolutely.
We are wild in ourselves. Our body is wild. The blood in us is wild. Everything about us is, we're just sort of packets of wildness. And we should recognise that at the same time that the rest of what we consider to be over there is actually the rest of our body. And we need to be that careful with it. I think I'll stop there.
Oh, Mart, thank you. And it's perfect that you're able to be with us this morning. Thank you. And thank you for what you began here and what, yes, Moritz is carrying on now. And before him, Mark did after you very understandably stepped back wanting a bit of retirement. And I'm sitting here, if I just look to my left, I can see out to the meadow to the west of Othona's chapel. And I remember, yes, when that used to be mown tight to short grass, it was fairly flat. You could happily play football on it if you wanted to. Now, because of how you began looking after it, what is it? Well, there are some rather wonderful great ant hills among it. You mentioned about the insects, and the ants have symbiotic relationships with other species. I think you would know more about that than I do, Mart. But that kind of thing is just a tiny example of how even the landscape, the shape of the land begins to change when you let nature fashion it rather than simply controlling it in the way that we do with a neatly mown lawn.
Well, ants are really good because they carry seeds and stuff around, so they'll pick something up and move it, and so a lot of plants get spread by them.
Yeah. I wonder if there's somebody else who wanted to comment out there. Do use the raise hand facility, or if you can't find that on your computer, then wave at us vigorously with your camera on. I see a raised hand from Ruth, yes.
Yes, I think one easy thing we could all do probably is not mow our lawns so much. I get away with doing mine about 2 or 3 times a year, and that's because I don't like doing it. But I think there's a sort of macho thing that you've got to have a neat lawn, and as soon as it's the weather is at all suitable, you've got to get the mower out. And this probably is a culture, I think, that is changing. And another thing that we can do that's all very easy is make compost, which is very, very satisfying and very natural. And we need to relearn that skill. One slight more comment, David Gow, who talked about beware of visionaries. But at the same time, I felt he was something of a visionary as well. And yeah, great talk, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah. Anybody else, please? Or any reflection on not only what we've been talking about today, but if you've been with us earlier. Caroline, looks like.
Yeah, I'm just blown away by the talk and the fact that it's I've kind of come into this, just the timing is perfect, because I'm not a conservationist or anything. I don't know a lot about it, but I do have a very deep trust in nature and our belonging to nature, and that if we work with it, you know, it protects us. And like you know, Mart said, we are it. And so I'm learning ways to trust that, you know, in terms of, you know, approaches to health and medicine, and as well. And I just felt really moved by the talk and very grateful that I could be here today and that I saw it in time. And it's a really incredible subject. And yeah, I feel very, very glad that I could be part of this meeting. So I just wanted to say thank you, really.
And you're heard. Thank you, Caroline. Yes. This is a moment to remind you all that we have a page with details of all the people who've contributed as speakers to these 5 sessions, usually with a link perhaps to their own website or to organisations that they're involved with, or a book they've written, those kind of links. I will be adding in a link to the other available talks from the Help Our Planet talk series that Derek Gow was recorded for. Unfortunately, because of a technical problem with their website connection, I can't quite put that up yet, but I will let that be known as soon as I can. All the others are on a page which you can access from the same web page that you clicked through to join this Zoom. And if you can't just get back to that, if you look again at the newsletter that gave you notice of this, you'll find how to get to that page, and then you click through again from the bottom. And it's also up on the chat screen now. If you open click on chat, probably towards the bottom of your screen, depends what sort of device you're watching this on. We've got some of those links provided. Thank you, V. So we've got, for our speakers, further information, there's a direct link there. You could just click on that and bring it up on a new tab on your machine, and also link to Derek Gow's book, Bringing Back the Beaver. If you didn't love beavers before that talk, I challenge you not to love them now. Yeah, there are beavers reintroduced, not more than about 20 minutes drive from where we are. I don't know the exact location. I have a fair idea, but I'm afraid if I told you, I'd have to kill you. So, or possibly kill myself. Now, I wonder, and I will also mention that on the details page, which V's given you the link to, there is a donate button. Creating this series of Zooms hasn't been without its costs, and if you want to donate to Othona to help us in what we've done with that, or also in what we do with our own land, then please feel free to do that using online donation. And I should say a bit of good news. Let me give you. We have heard in recent days of a grant from the Trumark Trust. I'll be putting more about this in an upcoming newsletter, but a grant towards ecological land management here. So that what Moritz, our groundsman, already does, we can increase with the support of that funding. So we're very grateful to the Trumark Trust for that. And I hope you'll see when you visit us next some of the fruits of that extra work that he's able to put into the conservation management of our land here. Well, we're very close, aren't we, to 12:30? I think, is there anybody else with something? Yes, something to say here.
We have a raised hand.
Oh, we've got a raised hand. Rosie Sinton-Evans. Let's hear from you.
I just wanted to say thank you for making this available for us. As a city dweller, I do feel very out of my depth, and I love the city, actually.
And even as an inhabitant of Enfield, who managed to produce that very difficult document about not having beavers. So, gosh, lots for me to think about. But thank you for making this a very important subject, something that is going to be at the heart of Othona, because I'm sure that that's the right thing for us to do. That's it.
And I know that our colleagues at the Bradwell Centre, the Essex Centre of Othona, have some important similar events coming up later in the year. They're going to have a particular green weekend. I don't have the details to hand here, but I will be putting that on our newsletter very shortly, so that you can look at that, and some people might want to book and attend that. I don't know if it'll be available online. I suspect parts of it will be. Thank you, Rosie. Marion Derbyshire's got her hand up. Marion, yes, we only have time for brief comments now, but Marion is involved here at the moment as our key gardening volunteer. The part of our land which we do try and produce a bit of food on, wonderful salads. Marion, over to you.
I just wanted to ask you, if it's too early to ask you maybe, if you have any thoughts on where we go from here in terms of like the people who have shown such an interest over this weekend actually getting involved in action at the Othona Burton Prescott Centre.
It is too early to ask me, but it's that kind of question that is very helpful. I think we need to think about that. We are at the moment in a stage of quite a lot of interesting new possibilities coming onto our planning horizon, if you like. And I can't second guess where we'll get to, because it isn't just down to me anyway, even if I knew what I thought would work best. But it's something this place, sometimes when people visit here, they think of the 4 or 5 of us who live here as the community that make things happen. The wide community of people involved with Othona is crucial. B, very importantly, are the people who volunteer their time significantly, like you, Marion, with getting your hands in the soil, like people who do committee work and trustee work, immense work to keep an organisation like Othona going and able to do, to look to the future in new ways, not just do same old, same old. So we need to make sure that this is something that we build upon, a way of involving more people's interest and voluntary effort. But that doesn't just happen easily. That takes reasonable organisation, so that people's voluntary effort isn't wasted, or they don't end up frustrated and so on. So for us on the ground, that's an interesting challenge, how we do that. But we are so grateful for what you and Rob and John have been doing, particularly over this last year for us, which means we've had better and more food from the garden here to put on our plates and the plates of all our visitors than I can remember in former years. So well done, you. Thanks, and good question. Keep pushing me with questions, but not this morning. One other person had a hand up, I think. Was there somebody else who wanted to come in?
It was a question in the chat.
Oh, a question in the chat, yes. Oh, can you please just remind where we will find the YouTube recordings of these sessions this weekend? Okay. One cannot immediately YouTube sessions like this. I have to do a little bit of editing. I've done that on one of the sessions. And as soon as the 5 YouTubes are all edited and available, I will put links to them in one of our newsletters. If you don't get the Othona newsletter and want to subscribe to it, I'll just ask V to put my email up on the chat, and just email me and say that's what you want to do. There may be some people watching out there, for instance, who've been referred to this morning's Zoom by one of our other speakers or by a friend or whatever. But it's easy to subscribe and easy to unsubscribe if you decide you've had enough of our lovely newsletters. Okay. I think that's probably it. Because of time, you are spared from hearing my song about the glowworm. There you are, breathe a sigh of relief. Who knows, I might put that on the newsletter one day soon. Thank you so much for your attendance and interest at this or any of the 5 climate crisis, what can we do in 22 sessions from the Othona community and from our library here in West Dorset. This is Tony Jaques signing off. Thanks everybody, and may we all look to a more sustainable future for not only the human species, but for all the species on our planet.